I'm joined now by Canada's ambassador to the US, Ambassador Kirsten Hillman, here at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C. to discuss all of the latest issues in American politics and more specifically how those issues have been impacting Canadians. Ambassador, thanks so much for joining me.
Well, thanks, and welcome to Washington. We're happy to have you here.
Let's just start out with the most recent midterm elections. What do you foresee the impact of that being on Canada?
Well, I guess there's a couple ways to answer that question. First and foremost, one of our biggest responsibilities here at the Embassy and with our 12 networks across the country is to make sure that we know the lawmakers on the Hill that you see behind us. So the Senate and the House. There are a number of new House members and some new senators that have been elected, and so one of the first things that we're going to do, and I've already started to do, is to get out there and meet them and talk to them and build relationships. That happens here at the Embassy, but as I say, all of our consulates around the country, that's their job too. So the first impact is we have new people to meet, we have new people to sort of build relationships with, and that's central to the work that we do. And then secondly, I guess, we will monitor, as many people are, what the tone of the Hill is and the dynamics on the Hill for the kinds of issues that matter to Canadians. There are certain things that happen up there that really don't relate to us too much. They're much more domestic focused, but there's a lot that goes on that matters. For example, anything in the trade and economic space, the international security space, relating to the war in Ukraine, and a variety of other things.
And you mentioned ensuring that you build those relationships with different members of Congress and the new members of Congress. By doing that, what can ultimately be made of that, and how will that ultimately benefit Canadians to a certain extent?
Yeah.
And what might Canadians expect from this new Congress?
Okay. So, well, I guess the first thing I would say is something that people often don't realize when I talk to Canadians about our relationships here is they think that our relationships and the things that matter to Canadians have a strong partisan bend one way or another. And our experience is much, much less than people might think. And that's because the issues that matter to Canadians and to Americans are often very local. So if you live in a state or in a province close to the border, you're going to care about border management, you're going to care about ease of crossing the border, you're going to care about the waterways that cross the border, the physical infrastructure. People care about business relations back and forth. Property owners in Florida care about their property that they own in Florida. So they tend to be things that are very local here within the United States. And that doesn't break down on partisan lines. Because all politicians in Canada, but as well as here in the US, are looking to respond to what matters to their voters. And so we find, and a good example of this was in the renegotiation of the NAFTA, we had a lot of really, really strong supporters in the Democratic Party, and we had a lot of really, really strong supporters in the Republican Party. And that's because those politicians represent people whose livelihoods, whose jobs, whose business relationships are intertwined with Canada. So that's the first part of your question. I think the second question, correct me if I'm wrong here, I think the second part of your question is, what we do with that under the new Congress. And again, it comes back to kind of getting to know people, right? Getting to know their constituencies, what their constituencies care about, and finding common cause where we have it.
And how Canada and the US address some of these important issues, environmental sustainability, economic and job creation, how might that be different, and how can that ultimately lead to kind of that good core policy development on some of those fronts?
Well, I think for Canada, it is, in the economic area in particular, it is something that requires tending and attention all the time, no matter what, no matter who's in the White House, no matter who's in government in our country, because we're a trading nation, Canada. We're very much more a trading nation than the Americans, and the vast majority, over 70% of our trade is with the United States. So making sure that we have strong, open, rules-based, predictable trade is vital to Canada's economic prosperity. So it's not something where we can take our eye off the ball ever. So that's why we spend an awful lot of time on those issues, and they do matter to Canadians. Again, in the environmental space and policies around, fighting climate change, but also very local issues around protecting specific ecosystems that we share with the Americans. As I say, it's a question of really understanding what we have in common. And another thing is, it's really important for us to build those relationships, to find things in common before we have a problem or before we're trying to do something. It's much easier to solve a problem or to pursue a project together if you've just built a relationship ahead of time, if you've done things together or even just had a few conversations about things you have in common with lawmakers. And so we work hard at doing that as well, so that when we pick up the phone about an issue, they already know us, and they're already inclined to understand how important the relationship is.
And just lastly, before we conclude, as it relates to kind of polarization in politics, and obviously in the US with January 6th that happened a few years ago now, and just moving forward into future election cycles, how can that be prevented? Because we know that even when it happens in the US, it does kind of have almost like an overarching effect on Canada as well.
Yeah. So, I was here during January 6th. I was here in the aftermath for President Biden's inauguration. That was, the scene that we see out the window here behind us looked very different at that time, with it completely locked down, with incredible security. And that was at once a sad experience, but also a really inspiring experience, because despite the fact that only a couple of weeks earlier there had been this very violent and difficult situation here on the Mall, the American people and very much the American government and lawmakers of both parties were determined to move forward and have a transition of government that was safe and secure and inspiring to their people. And they succeeded in doing that, in my opinion. Having been there, I found it inspiring, somewhat sad in the aftermath of what people had seen, but also inspiring that they weren't going to be daunted by that. So that kind of gets to your question. For Canadians, this is what I believe. I believe that we must fight for our democracy. I believe that we must always be aware of threats or weakening of any of our democratic institutions. And that includes the courts, that includes journalism and the work that you do, that includes the institutions of our democracy, so how elections are run, how they are monitored, how we ensure that they're free and fair and open, how we ensure that the maximum number of people can vote. All of these things require constant care and attention. And here they learned that and are continuing to work on that through some very difficult times. But we should also be very aware of it in Canada. We shouldn't ever be complacent. This requires, democracies are hard work, and we have to fight for them.
Okay, Kirsten Hillman, Canada's ambassador to the United States. Ambassador, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Wyatt. Great to talk to you.
Thank you.